Now, our fourth speaker, Richard Tanter, who you all know very well, who is unable to join us in person, but in fact, he will speak to us via Zoom. Have we got Richard? We do. Thank you very much.
Annette, thank you very much. And I'm speaking to you from Nam on lands of the Wurundjeri people. I think that's important to acknowledge immediately, obviously for reasons of politeness, but also for the reasons that Emma mentioned in her excellent presentation about the woven racism through our foreign policy and defence policy for a long time. I'd also like to take the chance to thank IPAN, not just for the invitation, but for this terrific meeting, and in particular, the editorial team behind the production of the report of the work of the IPAN inquiry and the inquiry itself. The report's terrific, and I thank him. And really, coming after three really terrific speakers, I think what I'm going to do is focus very tightly on 5 matters that I think are really important, and 5 things I think peace movements really have to follow on from about that. I think we're on the edge, as I think all 3 speakers have made clear, an historically almost irrevocable historical choice of enmity with China based on collaboration, active collaboration with the United States in an existential threat to China. And in that, I'm talking about the role, of course, of Pine Gap, but also the possible role of B-52 bomber task forces in terms of nuclear attack on China in the event of full-scale war. That is something we have not faced before, something which China would never forget. That we volunteered for this role, whatever else you may think about China. Firstly, I think the focus should be on understanding Australia as a highly militarised country. Liberal countries like Australia find it very hard to think of themselves that way, but we are, and we're particularly an example of liberal militarisation, like the United States itself, high technology, partly in the way that Vince has just alluded to, but an alliance-dependent form of militarisation. For all the talk of renewed self-reliance, as Vince has just shown us quite nicely, it's still within a particular role supporting our major ally. And we are highly dependent in that role. Running through all of this is the legacy of untranscended settler colonial history, and again, the racism that frames very certainly our approach to China, as Emma emphasised so clearly. I don't need to say anything here now about the northern militarisation pattern that ranges from Northwest Cape, not just the submarine communication base, but also the new space warfare capabilities there, through to Darwin, through to Tyndall, and of course down to Pine Gap itself. In policy terms, I think Vince has said a great deal of what I would say, except that I now think we are talking about a new language of modernised forward defence, in addition to the self-reliant aspect that Vince was talking about. We also, and I just remind you that 3 former deputy secretaries of defence had talked about the need for Australia to reconsider nuclear weapons of its own. So clearly, the engagement about self-reliant defence, independent foreign policy has got to be a focus, obviously, for groups like IPAN. Secondly, on AUKUS, there's almost nothing to say after Emma's description of the high level of danger and dysfunction that comes out of the United States today. Malcolm Fraser wrote Dangerous Ally in 2012, before Trump, before the insurrection in the Capitol, before public opinion polls, respectable public opinion polls showing that more than 40% of Americans, of all Americans, believe that civil war is at least somewhat likely in the next 10 years. What kind of ally is that? The level of danger, the level of dysfunction, this is something on which we are seeking to rely. This is really very, very dangerous now. I won't say anything about the United Kingdom, which is soon to be disunited, I suspect, but except that I think the principle aspect of the AUKUS deal may be about a form of American-backed industrial subsidy to Britain's nuclear submarine capability. Enough said about that, and we can talk about that another time perhaps. This is a dangerous and dysfunctional set of allies, particularly the United States. Britain itself is a dependent nuclear power entirely. The third thing so that obviously leads to emphasis on independent and defence and foreign policy. The third thing I'd like to talk about briefly, which has not been mentioned so far, is that the United States has in fact re-orchestrated its global alliance system very effectively in the last 10 years, in particular, and in our part of the world in the last 5. Australia is now a leading enhanced strategic partner of NATO. Our Prime Minister made one of his first overseas visits to participate in the NATO summit. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but we have shared a war with NATO partners, NATO leadership in Afghanistan for 20 years, as well as Iraq and Syria. In addition to global NATO, and I remind you that South Korea, a serious nuclear power, actually, a serious military power, and Japan, also a serious military power, are also Pacific strategic partners of NATO. So there's a pattern of integration there. And secondly, somewhat unnoticed, there is a new pattern of, if you like, second level US alliance partners, Japan, Australia, France, and South Korea, for example, forming bilateral relationships between each other of a highly standardized kind in terms of commitments to intelligence cooperation, strategic planning, interoperability, heightened training, and of course now including not just Japan and India and France, with both of which we now have heightened security agreements, but also India, with which we also have a heightened security agreement, and India in turn has new security agreements with both in Japan, which is a long way, of course, from India, and also with France. France is, of course, a long way from India, but French colonies in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are not. That is extremely important in buttressing this new alliance relationship, which I think for the peace movement means we need a new set of partners to talk to in each of those countries to find our forms of alliance for peace. Fourthly, the question of China. This has dominated everything that we've talked about today in all 3 speakers, and I'm very pleased that David mentioned the question of the influence of the foreign influence legislation, if I can use that mangled grammar there, in terms of the malign influence, absolutely malign influence on open discussion in universities. I think we need to talk about China. We need to talk about it in particular, not just for the reasons that were being discussed, for example, by Vince, in terms of US planning for a China war, but also because there has been a very successful ideological construction of a set of equations, of pairs, 3 pairs. The first is that, of course, that Russia equals China. And Russia, whatever else you may want to argue about the origins of the war in Ukraine, is behaving like a fascist state. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I don't think that's China, for all of the criticisms I have of it. Secondly, President Putin equals President Xi. Now, Putin is an extremely strange and I think highly dangerous character. Xi is a different kettle of fish and very, very different. But the equation is working very well, that arc of autocracies that I think that several speakers mentioned. And thirdly, that Ukraine equals Taiwan. What has happened, what Russia has done to Ukraine equals what China will definitely do to Taiwan. I actually think it's highly insulting to Taiwan, which is one of the most interesting and less corrupt countries in Asia. But I think it's a very powerful and effective form of ideological framing. And I think we have to work to break through it. I think we have to talk about what's happening in Xinjiang and Tibet, which is settler colonialism on steroids. David knows a great deal more about this than I would. But as Australians, we ought to be recognising this and then arguing about how we ought to talk about it. I think that we need to talk about the repression that's happening in China, but I'm also concerned about talking about the horrors of capitalism in China, whether it's CCP directed or not. Hang on, I'm out of time. I'll be very brief and talk about that. I think we have to talk very directly about China with intellectual honesty. And I think we have to find ways of making links to dialogue partners in China. This is extremely hard, very obviously, but done with care, done with skill, done with respect, and above all, done with honesty about what we agree with and what we disagree with. There's at least the beginnings of building a civil society capability of at least mitigating that set of ideological equations as mentioned, and the malign influences of government policy that David has talked about so clearly. I think that's really, really important. So a whole new set of peace movement links, extremely hard to build, of course, but that's the point. Lastly, I want to say something very quickly about the role of IPAN and the peace movement generally on nuclear threat. You know about extended nuclear deterrence and how absurd, obscene, and strategically reckless it is. It's the most interesting thing that's been written in a long time about extended nuclear deterrence was written by the former Assistant Secretary of Defence, Alan Beam, now with the Australia Institute, and a paper written for the Nautilus Institute a year or so ago. It is the most savage and deep-rooted critique of extended nuclear deterrence for Australia and generally, and I commend it to you. It's a really important piece of work. You know about the bases, you know about Pine Gap's role in constructing an electronic order of battle for an American war with China. You know about Pine Gap's role in providing targeting data for the crucial American second strike on China after China has fired its really very small nuclear deterrent capabilities. But I think that the understanding that as an existential threat to China still has not got through in Australia. This is deeply serious. And partly this is because we keep talking in the peace movement as much as in government about nuclear deterrence as the focus of our concern, whereas in fact what the militaries in Washington and Moscow and in Beijing are planning, of course they would like deterrence to work. Who wants a nuclear war? But deterrence will fail at some point. At the moment, the bet is it will work forever, which is nonsensical. But what they're concerned about is what happens when nuclear deterrence fails, and then how to win the war. No country goes into a war not planning to at least survive, if not win. And so nuclear war fighting is really what's on the agenda, and we have signed up to our part in that. So I think it's really very important campaigning about these issues. I think immediately, and the ABC's revelations about the B-52 bomber task force set to be installed at RAF Tyndall and Katherine in the Northern Territory makes very clear that we must urge the government, demand the government declare that under no circumstances would American nuclear weapons be allowed into Australia as perhaps a temporary visit, a passing transit visit under the Southwest Pacific nuclear weapon-free zone. We must demand, we absolutely must demand the government to be overtly clear about this. Under no conditions will American nuclear weapons be allowed to enter into Australia, and no Australian government will accept American, excuses, if you like, the excuses for the Australian government of neither confirming nor denying whether nuclear weapons are on board. We need an absolutism here. We also need the peace movement campaign absolutely on the question of Australian nuclear weapons, because I think one part of the group that Vince was so eloquently describing to us is in fact very seriously considering Australian nuclear weapons. And lastly, I think it's really important for the peace movement as a whole to get behind in very active campaigning for Australia, for the Albanese government to sign and ratify the nuclear ban treaty. That's the best form of security for Australia in these times. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.